Hello and welcome to Westport. My name is Tara Clark and I'm the producer for Westival 2020. For this year's Westival, we are delighted to be in a creative partnership with Belfast International Arts Festival. It gives me great pleasure to introduce the wonderful author and writer Patrick Freyne, hosted by Hugh Odling-Smee. And don't forget, you can buy any of our speakers' books in Tertulia or Duffy's Bookshops Westport and in various bookshops across Belfast. And don't forget tomorrow, folks, Sunday at 2 o'clock, we have Elaine Feeney and Daisy Johnson, hosted by Mary-Louise Muir. For further information on any of these events, please check out westival.ie or Belfast International Arts Festival.
Hello everyone, welcome to this Belfast International Arts Festival and Westival production, and I'm delighted. My name is Hugh Odling-Smee, so I'm your host online. This is very strange, obviously, that we're doing this online. Normally we'd have a roaring crowd around us screaming and hollering as we walked into the room, but here we are, and I'm delighted to be joined today by Patrick Freyne. Hello, Patrick.
Hello.
Where are you speaking to me from today?
Speaking from my dining room in Marino in Dublin, which is where I do my work. And,
right.
Usually with the curtain drawn, pretending the world doesn't exist outside. So well, this is just an extension of that for me now.
You don't even need to leave your own home.
Pretty much.
Well, I hope nobody starts dissecting your bookshelf behind you.
Oh yeah, that can be dangerous. These are also my wife's books, so if there's anything problematic, it's hers.
That's okay. That's okay. Yeah, I think you'll get away with it. Hopefully the Twitter pylon won't happen. We're going to talk to you about your new book. Okay, let's do your stupid idea. Have I got that on camera? Yes, I think you can read that. That's good. Which is out this Thursday. So we are talking in September. So this is going out in October, confusingly, but yeah. So will be available in all good bookshops, including No Alibis on Botanic Avenue, online or in person, and Tertulia in Westport as well, just representing the festival's commitment to independent booksellers, as well as the internet. Patrick, I was going to ask maybe if you'd introduce the book a little and maybe give us a bit of an extract if you're up for it.
Yeah, absolutely. So, Okay, Let's Do Your Stupid Idea is a collection of essays, largely kind of memoir essays that I wrote that depict everything in my life from being very, very young to more contemporaneously. Mm-hmm. And as I was writing it, it was kind of a fascinating, we'll talk about this later, but I'd been known a bit for writing funny columns for the Irish Times. And so I actually expected I'd write kind of funny David Sedaris-y, Clive Jamesy essays, and they kind of developed along the way because writing kind of is a form of thinking, and I started thinking a bit more deeply, and I started reading other stuff that influenced me. So it went to places I didn't quite expect. So the extract I'm going to read is from an essay called Stories About Driving, mm-hmm. because as a journalist and formerly in bands, I did loads and loads of driving. So I have a lot of thoughts about it. I'm just going to read a short bit about being out on the road with my band with a camper van that didn't quite work properly. And we're stuck at a garage on the way from Cork to Dublin.
Lovely. Have at it.
At 2 a.m, off the motorway somewhere between Cork and Dublin, Paul woke me. He had a problem, he said. He couldn't open the petrol tank in the camper van, and we really needed petrol. He wasn't sure of the science of it, he said, but he was pretty sure the van needed petrol to make it go. He'd already tried unsuccessfully to wake Dee. Dee is a practical man, but he was very wedded to the idea of a good night's sleep, and as a non-driver, he saw the camper van as our domain. There were other people sleeping in the camper too, people I love, but let's not beat around the bush here. When it came to practical concerns, they were fools. So I got up, and blinking in the light of a petrol station forecourt, I slapped my hands together like I'd seen more practical men do. I found that what Paul said was true. The cap of the petrol tank felt almost welded shut. So with a big effort, I wrenched the plastic external casing of the petrol cap off the van entirely. This left the metal internal casing lodged in the passage that, under more normal circumstances, brought petrol to the engine. Oh no, I said. I knew that was going to happen, said Paul unhelpfully. But Paul was an optimist. He imagined that he could see a little hole in the obstructed petrol tank, and that he'd be able to pump petrol through it if only I would create a funnel with the magazine I was reading, which, not that it's important, was probably Select or The Face. Really, I said. I think it'll work, said Paul. Trust me. I didn't trust him. But I did convince myself that this was my idea, which is what I often did in lieu of trusting my bandmates. So I carefully crafted a little funnel with my magazine and angled the narrow end of this funnel to where Paul believed he saw a hole in the jagged remains of the petrol cap. Then he started pumping little flurries of petrol into my magazine paper funnel. One of our beloved friends, Fools, stirred within the van and stared out the window vacantly. What did he think was happening? He waved, turned around, and went back to sleep. The funnel, despite the effort that had gone into its construction, disintegrated because it was made of paper. So now there I was, a wash of petrol streaming through my cupped hands, and a picture of Brett Anderson from Suede affixed to my wrist, and a little pool of liquid was forming at my feet. I'm not sure this is working, I said, while Brett Anderson from Suede's mournful eyes judged me, and I felt faint due to petrol fumes. I was pretty sure this had never happened to Brett Anderson from Suede. He might have written songs about sniffing solvents, but he didn't splash around in them. Yeah, I think you're right, said Paul. But he kept pumping petrol anyway, his shoulder to my shoulder, as though he wanted to make completely sure that this was a lost cause before we moved on to plan B. What's up? Said the guitar player, who had just poked his newly awoken head between our fume-addled heads. God, I'd love a cigarette, I thought, as I gazed at the lovely Marlborough light hanging from the guitar player's lip. I stared at it, glowing there in the darkness, a half a foot above the gentle stream of petrol that was flowing through my hands and onto my trousers and into a glistening puddle at my feet. I think of this moment often. I think of it whenever people say, as they occasionally do, "You had a band and released records and went on tour. That's amazing. Do you ever imagine what might have been?" And I nod sagely, because I do imagine what might have been. First, I imagine this moment in a petrol station forecourt with petrol streaming through my hands. And then I imagine myself running around on fire and screaming on the edge of the N7. That's what might have been, my friends. Don't let anyone tell you otherwise.
Marvelous. Thank you, Patrick. I would imagine that there would be in the real world a round of applause for that. So,
I'd hope. Who knows? Maybe it's traumatic.
The least they could do. Yeah, well, very traumatic indeed. The life on the road. Did he get out of it all right? Did he get petrol? How did he survive it?
No, my dad saved us. We managed to get the van to my parents' house in Kildare, and this isn't the fun bit.
No,
and then my dad came out with all his tools and fixed up the van.
Yeah. But a practical person.
A practical person. We were practical in some very specific ways, but in a lot of ways we weren't.
Yeah, well, it's a difficult sort of thing. The recklessness of youth and all that sort of stuff. I once my friend and I were driving the Arts Council van. The Arts Council van is a legendary vehicle that was kept alive basically for about 30 years. And the Arts Council used to let you do it for tours. So we went down to Galway and Nuns Island, and we all did a show down there. And then the van broke down, and the window broke, and everybody went home except me and my mate. And we pushed it. I had to push it into the guard station, because the window was broken. It had about 50,000 quid's worth of sound equipment in the back. So in the end, it was the pump fuel. So the guy came along and he said, "You're going to have to run the fuel line into a drum, which is going to sit at your feet, and then that's going to just pump through, and you'll just have to fill up the drum."
Yeah.
So we drove basically back up to Belfast with a drum of about 25 litres of petrol and the line going in out at my feet the whole way along.
Who knew being nearly exploded was just part of growing up?
Yeah.
In those days.
Wild risks.
Yeah.
Yeah, I don't know. I don't think we filled that in on the Arts Council report form. Actually what happened, but anyway, it was good. Patrick, thank you for that extract. It gives a really good sense of kind of the small things in life, but also trying to find meaning in them. and you know, sort of put some kind of meaning onto the events of a life. I always ask the question first: who did you write this book for?
So in a roundabout answer to that, so definitely not my friend Corncrick, who appears in this book, and he appears in the preface. And I sent him kind of early essays, and he read them and very kindly rang me and said, "These are very interesting, Patrick, but I don't know who's going to read them. I'd only be interested in reading a book about someone's life if it was Napoleon or Julius Caesar or some famous general." So I kind of had to explain to him the existence of memoir as a kind of form. And so for starters, people who know that memoir exists, like the other answer is that I wrote it kind of for myself. I wrote the kind of book I was enjoying reading at the moment, and the version of it that I thought I could do. For like a long time, I'd been interested in, like, some of the stories, as you can probably tell when you read it, are the types of stories I've told friends, you know, over the years, like that one on the side of the motorway. Or there's other essays in the book that are kind of like my classic hits at dinner parties. And I always expected I'd write something funny around those sort of things. In, like, I love Clive James and Nora Ephron and people who write from their lives. But as I kind of said, in the process of writing it, like, I had read a lot of work by people like Emily Pine and Sinead Gleeson, and my colleague in the Irish Times, Rosita Boland, people like Deborah Levy and Olivia Lang. And I was just struck by how in personal writing you can really get to the truth of things. And sometimes without intending to. So I found that as I was writing, the more I wrote, the more I remembered. And the more I remembered, it didn't always go to a funny place. And sometimes if I tried to force it to be funny, it kind of ruined the point. So I had a very interesting journey writing it in terms of kind of thinking about the point of humor, because I love funny things. And I think humor is often it's often underappreciated in art. And I think it's a great way of describing things, and it can be a great way to throw light on things, to think of a funny metaphor or come up with a punchline. And then there's other ways in which humor can deflate what you're trying to say. Like, I also, after I'd written it, a friend told me to watch Hannah Gadsby's stand-up show, Nanette. And she actually makes that point really well in that show about, like, the first half of the show is a very, very funny stand-up show. And then the second half is actually a really kind of philosophical, political, personal deconstruction of the first half, where she explains what really happened, how those funny stories weren't funny, and how in making them funny, she was doing a disservice to herself. So, I'm more thoughtful now about humor than maybe I was.
Yeah, I think so. I think it's very interesting because it does start off as a kind of sort of knockabout kind of funny stories from your childhood and things like that. But the book is quite, it's an awful cliche, but it's sort of roller coaster ride in the sense that, you know, you're sort of lapping along at a very kind of kind of enjoyable, very funny stories, and the sort of things that newspaper columnists do quite well in terms of, you know, how you condense a funny story and a memory into something. But then, you know, large events come in and you know, difficult things come in, and then tragedy comes in as well. I mean, I wondered, you know, was it an exercise for you when you were writing it of, it's not therapy, but kind of trying to understand those things and trying to understand where they fit?
Absolutely. And I know from watching interviews with other essay writers that there's very different opinions on the idea of catharsis through writing. Like, I know that some writers think it devalues the work to think that it's therapy, whereas I actually did find some of this writing quite therapeutic. And I think that's because I've been a journalist for a long time, but I've never really written about myself. Like, I largely either write kind of culture columns with a kind of witty slant, or I write reportage where I'm very concentrated on the other person's story. And as a consequence, I was kind of 44, 43 maybe when I started writing these things first. And they'd probably been waiting to come out for some time. So there was a kind of bit of a relief of getting some of it down on paper. And there's something like beautiful about the essay form in terms of, say, unlike an opinion column, which I don't do anyway, but unlike opinion columns, which are very much about knowing what you're saying, the essay is an exploratory form. Like it's sometimes the conclusion is I still don't know. You know, I've processed a lot of it, and you can read that on the page, but I still don't know what this means. And sometimes you do arrive to conclusions, and you put sometimes, like I think I have a line in the book about how on the one hand I have a line in the book pointing out that kind of neat narratives are always kind of lies, because you can, like I had very conveniently at one point, for example, I had issues with real hypochondria, where I was constantly going to the doctor. I made my doctor a rich man, I think, but I was kind of, but I kind of always psychoanalyzed myself and put it down to a death of a close friend when I was 21. Yeah. And another friend goes, "No, you were like this when you were 19. Do you not remember?" And I went, "Oh," and I kind of had to unpsychoanalyze myself and go, so I still don't know. But even the process of going through all that, or not knowing what I felt about things, and sometimes the essay themes were about like I have an essay about singing, and I wanted to explore what I felt about singing because it's very important to me. I have an essay about driving where I wanted to explore the role driving had in my life, and I didn't really have conclusions. Sorry for the strange things happened. Like that story about driving ends with, it's a lot of vignettes from my life. I'd written the whole thing and it was sent off to my editor, Brendan, and everything as a rough draft before I realized I'd forgotten that I was in a pretty serious car crash when I was 13. And it had completely fallen out of my brain.
I thought that was fascinating. You know, just in the way that, the essays became discoveries for yourself. I mean, there's the listener should be in no way understanding that you're not bigging yourself up in this book. I think you're I mean, we would say you're really taking the piss out of yourself for quite large sections of it, and there is a sense where you're very aware of your own character and how sometimes they're quite ridiculous situations that you put yourself in, and sometimes your behavior is, you know, a little off beam, should we say. And I really find that very refreshing. You weren't the hero in it. You were, you know, the sort of author who was discussing these things, but there wasn't a sense that this was an episode. It's a memoir without the vainglory of many memoirs.
I'm glad, because I would have felt ridiculous if it, like, I mean, I also kind of stand by the idea that, and I'm also conscious that, like, in a lot of ways, I'm a privileged person, you know, and that to some degree, this is somebody who was quite free and easy in their 20s, you know, in those earlier stories. But I do hold on, like the title comes from a passive, okay, let's do your stupid idea, as a passive aggressive approach I have to, you know, other people's stupid ideas, which I largely learned from arguing with my bass player, Dara, in the band, where I realized that you can waste so much time arguing against an idea you think is stupid when you could just try it. And you can have the passive aggression as long as you internalize it and don't say it, because then if it's a successful idea, you've played a part in it and you can take some credit. And I do think that lots of the, like creatively, one of my strong beliefs is that everyone should feel the right and the ability to be creative, whether that's in music or writing or art, and that we gain a lot by trying things even if they fail. And so some of those things that in retrospect are kind of dodgy bits of my character sometimes led to good things, like even the vainglory of pushing out records when you could barely play in your 20s, which again is probably a very male thing to do. But back then, maybe. Back then. I don't know. It's kind of, I think failure is good. Like, I mean, and actually that's a privileged thing to say too, because not everyone gets to recover from their failures, and you know, middle class white guys tend to get another chance.
Have safety nets and structures. And one thing is quite interesting about the essay form. You mentioned a litany of writers there. You know, Sinead Gleeson, Emily Pine, who was a guest of the festival last year, and Rosita Boland, and so on. I mean, obviously, the interesting characteristics is they're all women. And in terms of one of the things I found from someone round about your age was the memory of being a young man in the 90s and the kind of the strangeness of being a young man. And I hadn't really read essays that were from that perspective, a male perspective in that sense, for quite a long time. That weren't, you know, sort of waspish New York memoir or, you know, that sort of thing. And that was one of the things I got most out of the book. Now, in no way are you a spokesman for a generation, and I you know, I'm hoping I'm not going to see you in a Batman uniform, sort of marching up O'Connell Street. But there was as a man writing about these things in a kind of a milieu of essays that are about, you know, very often very, very difficult to read, essays about what it's like to be a woman in the modern world and what it's been like to grow up. How did that feel writing that? Was it something you were aware of writing, or?
Not necessarily. I'm very much shaped by that. Like I'm like I probably read more women writers than male writers anyway, just by accident, but maybe not by accident. Like I've always had, feminism was really important to me, and I think I'm very much shaped by it. And I think most men of my generation have been shaped by feminism in a really powerful, positive way, even if they don't acknowledge it. They probably should acknowledge it. Mm-hmm. And they need to read books like Emily's and Sinead's.
Yeah,
and because I think that what's happening in women's memoir writing or essay writing is really powerful and really important, because it's expressing things that not only weren't said, but were actively discouraged from being said. Mm-hmm. And in the context of that, like a book like my book is kind of a sideshow that's very influenced by that. Mm. But I would never want to take away from the importance of what they're doing, and also the way that what they wrote shaped me. Like I think reading Emily's work and Sinead's work, and even since writing the book, I read Nuala Phelan's book for the first time. Yeah. And I read those books and the kind of the openness and the hurt that they managed to write about in a beautiful, intellectual but heartfelt way, it is really opening up for another writer to read. Like it encouraged me to not be afraid to go to some of the more painful places. Mm-hmm. Which I think is one of the gifts that feminism has given men, is of men of my generation anyway. Yeah. That you can open up, you can be an emotional being, and that there is a form of toxic masculinity. And I feel I was quite lucky for various reasons to have escaped that when I was growing up, mm-hmm. because I had a feminist mother, a feminist dad, even though he was like a tough army man, and I was always shaped by kind of the women around me, like really good, as well as the guys in the band. That like I lived in a house that was largely men, guys and girls all living together. Yeah. Also taking me to task, you know, for some of the bits of unquestioned privilege that I might have. Like I think it's funny. I have another bit in the book where I talk about a friend of mine who was then my girlfriend said, you know, you guys, we were running a pirate and anarchist radio station.
Yes, that's right.
And there was literally times where like a guy would get up and pontificate about feminism and no woman in the world would get a word in edgewise. Yeah. And like my friend Deanna going, you know, you guys, if you really thought about it, you should probably let us speak more, or leave us a gap to get a word in. And those are formative. And I know the irony of talking about this when I have a book about myself coming out. But I do want to put it in that context. Like that what's happening in those women's writing is very important. And
but I also think I mean, I also think that there's a sense that for a long time men weren't particularly honest about their experience as well, which makes it refreshing about, you know, yes, wanted to get laid, but also wanted to be kind of, you know, a positive actor in the world at the same time. I mean, you know, we would have been becoming young men when Loaded was happening, and when, you know, I was at university when Loaded exploded. But and when that, you know, when that happened, to the kind of conflict, you know, I mean, I had a lot of feminist influence when I was young as well, you know, sisters, mothers, brothers, all that sort of stuff. But when Loaded happened, it became a hugely conflicting kind of time and quite difficult. And I sort of think we're still living through the backwash of that now, you know, in terms of how representation, in terms of, you know, a kind of power and that kind of awful use of irony and those kind of things. Some misuse of irony, I suppose. What I find about your book was that there was a kind of honesty and a recognition of male faults and things, but there was a sense of a person living in clean air, of, you know, walking out and sort of thinking about these things, and having an open mind to their own existence. And I thought that was very refreshing. Yeah,
like I think I felt quite alienated by that ladism thing as well. That kind of came slightly after my days in college, when I think there's actually been a really, like, I think what's happened in the last few years is a reaction to a reaction. there was a reaction to the growth of feminism and thinking about race and thinking about gender and thinking about, you know, gay rights and things. And there's this kind of reaction that I think came from scared men. I don't know, like, where they were pretending to be ironic, but a lot of anger was coming out in that irony, and a lot of dehumanization of other types of people. And that never really sat well with me.
Sort of the othering of groups and people and things like that, and that sense that you were only as good as the front that you showed to the world.
And I think that in the last few years, like I wrote in the book, there's an essay called Brain Fever, which is about mental health. It's actually one of the first, I know I kind of said I was thinking it was going to be a funny book, but that was actually one of the first things I wrote for this. And it was, that was weirdly cathartic, because the first draft I did of it, I think I was almost too raw, and it was difficult. Like, I don't think it was, I want this stuff to be helpful to people. And sometimes if you're just bleeding on the page, it's just blood on a page. So I kind of went back and I rethought about it. And when I was feeling a bit better, actually, I kind of went back and I rewrote that essay. But that essay goes through my mental health difficulties over the years. And I've largely, I mean, generally I have a tendency towards depression and anxiety, but over the years it's manifested in different ways. And one of the reasons I wanted to write that was because I'd met a friend or an acquaintance and another journalist who said to me, you know, you seem like such a calm person. And I kind of realized, oh my God, I'm presenting a little, like, I'm not trying to, but I'm kind of presenting a front to the world. And I wanted to kind of correct that, because I think it's important that people talk about these things and know that somebody who can present like they're in control one time can have all this difficulty behind them another time. And I think, again, that's something that's changed in how like, I honestly don't, I think that if there weren't all these cultural influences, men and women wouldn't really be that different from one another. But there is that kind of masculine front that even someone like me, who's like largely an artsy, fey, hippie person, still had that influence, where I was presenting without thinking a face of complete
control,
equanimity and control, which is one of the reasons why personal essay writing is so interesting, because you can present layers, you know, and you realize that people are layers.
The other thing that comes through big in the book is something that is the value of friendship to you, and also family as well. I mean, obviously you're writing about your own life, so your family are going to be there, but your family sound tremendous people and very interesting, but also your relationship, your friendships, but also your sort of your friendships within the band that you had, which was called National Prayer Breakfast. Yeah, which takes on a slightly sinister thing now. If you watch the Republican National Prayer Breakfast, it's a very different kind of setup from a punk band in the 90s.
No one knew what that was then. We just found it in we used to read all these American punk zines, and I think we read some guy ranting about the National Prayer Breakfast, and I never heard about it. It's like a prayer thing that the president does in the state.
Yeah, I think so. And they attended. I mean, I think it's actually a Democrat thing as well. I think if there's a Democrat president, they go to it as well, and it's just keeping a tight grip on the nation through prayer. But in terms of friendship and family, I mean, how did they feel about reading about themselves? This is always a very stock answer for memoirs, but how did they feel reading about themselves and sort of seeing that stuff written down?
It was kind of interesting. Like I showed, for the most part, I showed people essays they appeared in, and people were generally fine with that. There's a couple of interesting things when you start kind of tugging at your memories. Like one is that other memories come out, and the other is that you realize when you talk to people that you have very different memories of events, not about very serious things, but just like practical things. Like, you know, I showed Dara from my band, you know, some of the essays involving the band, and he kind of corrected a lot of facts that I didn't know I'd wrong, like really simple things. And then there are other things where you realize that, like my friend Corncrake, who's called Corncrake in the book, that was his nickname. He didn't want his real name, but he's like my oldest friend. And at one point, I'm talking about him, and you know, I'm remembering dialogue, and he goes, "I don't curse," and I went, "Really?" And then I looked at it, and I went, so I had him saying, "Can I curse on this?" I probably can't. I say I had the F word,
right.
And I had him saying it, and he goes, I don't curse. And then I realized he doesn't curse. He's mad, but I've never heard him curse. So he said, "Could you change that to feckin'?" You know, and I do. And I went, okay. And it was just kind of, so there's kind of interesting, you start noticing things. I guess I really like reporting as a journalist.
Yeah.
And there was an element of reporting about your own life in this, you know, where you're fact checking things, you're interviewing yourself about your own memories, like what did you feel about that? And I'm asking myself the questions that I often ask.
But I suppose you've also got to develop that. I mean, you mentioned this in the chapter in journalism that we'll get onto in a minute, but a respect for the person's story that you're telling as well.
Yeah, and there's always a tension in that. Like on the one hand, you never want to misrepresent anything, but on the other hand, it's valid that there are different perspectives on the same event. And when you're writing a memoir, in a way, you're like a dictator who is enforcing this interpretation in the world. And even if it's only small differences in perspective, it must be slightly disconcerting to see somebody else's memory of an event, you know, being presented. Anytime there was a factual thing, I would change it, but it's still my perspective. So, you know, if I'm going, this was a daft decision that X made in the band, they're still going, no, it wasn't.
It was absolutely the right thing to do.
It was absolutely right. It was right to make us carry that hugely heavy piano to every gig.
Yeah, well, it's a Rhodes piano. It gave a whole kind of, you know, a whole extra dimension to your work, I'm sure. One of the most sort of affecting chapters is it's called Caring or Care, which is about when you worked in a psychiatric unit.
It was with people with intellectual disabilities, and then after a while working there, they put me in a unit it was called the behavioural unit. I don't know if they call it that now, but it was people who also exhibited kind of other kind of troubles and difficulties. You know?
And that seems to be a chapter that really seems to be quite a turning point in your life. Maybe that's too much to say. Maybe I don't know.
No, I think it had a huge influence on me. I did it and I'm sure people who have a career as a carer or are actually caring for family members will go, well, duh, like when I say this, because I did it for about a year and a half at most. But I found it really affected me in a lot of ways, and it probably reinforced and gave me a much more practical basis for some of my left-wing politics, in that I So the absolute way that life gets simplified in one level by being a carer, where if somebody's hungry, you feed them, and if somebody is bored, you entertain them. If somebody seems troubled, you try to get to the bottom of them. You try and talk to them and see if they can explain it to you.
Mm-hmm.
And in another way, it's as like a lot of people can respond to those wants and needs. So I do believe most of us can be competent carers,
mm-hmm.
but some people are just so skilled at it that and it really got me thinking about what we value in society, and the things we think is worth a lot of money, and the things that we think aren't, for what I now think are very stupid, selfish reasons. We've decided that certain types of care work doesn't deserve to be paid more than certain kinds of banker, or journalist, or
an accountant,
or an accountant, and I feel that that's just a rigged class system. Mm-hmm. And I kind of came away from there, like, nobody can tell me that, like, there's a belief that anyone can do it.
Yeah.
And it's just, anyone can do it, but there are very specific people who can do that really well, and they're brilliant at it. And I think I said in that essay that there's a kind of person, usually a woman, but not always a woman, who will go to a stranger on the bus who's crying, "Are you all right, love?" And that's an instinct, and it's an instinct that's not rewarded by society, and is often punished, because those people will go out of their way to help people even when they're not being paid extra. Whereas we seem to think that, oh, we have to pay bonuses to bankers because they'll leave. And my point now is, like, let them leave. Mm-hmm. Go. We should be paying bonuses to care workers and nurses,
and they can work remotely if needs be. They can go and live in Switzerland and then just work back in Dublin. I mean, I think the one of the things you mentioned around that in terms of, there was a lot of talk when COVID hit here. There was a lot of talk about, this is going to change our perception of how these sort of things. I mean, there was a lot of clapping for, all that. So I'm sure you saw all that on the news and things like that. And actually that happened right across Europe. It wasn't just about the NHS. It was, it was happening. In fact, it started in Italy, I think.
Yeah.
I mean, did you feel that there was a sense that something was changing around how we perceive carers or caring?
I think so. I hope it sustains. Like, I think there's generally a change anyway. You can see it in a younger generation of people for whom the current way things are set up don't work as well as it did when I was younger. For like, even relatively privileged people like me, it doesn't work as well anymore. And I think that people were beginning to see that there was a kind of rigged system, and that the things we value are not the things we should value, or the things that we value monetarily are not the things we should value. And certain kind of things play into that. The idea that, certain kinds of work are vocational and people will do it anyway because they're either creative or they're nice people, so why pay them extra? Which really begs the question, do we really want to fill the rosters of, like, kind of stockbroking firms of people who hate it so much that we have to pay them millions to keep them there? Like,
it doesn't seem like a sustainable plan.
It doesn't. I hope that there's been a change, and I hope that we can start. Like, I think there's a divisive kind of politics that's been played in Ireland and in Britain and in Northern Ireland that kind of pits middle class people who are there, and we're encouraged to think of themselves as strivers against everyone else who is. It was someone getting a free ride, and it's just not true. And that sort of divisive way of thinking about politics was a little bit unraveled in COVID, when we started thinking more about community and the fact that, if the next generation of kids has less money but has a kind community, that's better, There
was a sense, I mean, when you saw people kind of signing up to volunteer to, to move medicines around and to deliver for people who were isolating and things, there was a huge upsurge in community action. I mean, I suppose it's that choice that we always have, the road that we have about, do we choose George Osborne made that speech about, the person who never opens their curtains till 2 o'clock in the afternoon sort of thing. And, on your street whilst you're going out to work at 7 o'clock in the morning and things like that. I mean, I think that voice is quite interesting. I mean, it feels as though there have been moments over the last 10 years or so where we could have gone a different way, a different direction. But people either voted in a different way, or the promises that certain people were making didn't seem to stack up. But it did feel that COVID maybe changes things a little bit. Who knows?
And now we're all people who don't open our curtains till 2 in the day for various reasons. And lots of the people who don't open their curtains till 2 in the day, it's because they were doing night shifts in a hospital, like the very idea that you would pigeonhole people in that very narrow way suggests how narrowly they're focusing their message in the first place.
Yeah, I think that's fair. And I think the other thing is that, there's a sense that things change and societies can change and things like that, but that sense that, I don't know, that there are people trying to do you down, and that they're just by the way that they live their life. Maybe that will change slightly. The other thing, one of the chapters I really enjoyed was the chapter on journalism, which kind of strips down what you do and how you do it. And I thought that was very interesting. For listeners who don't know, you're a well-known writer for Irish Times. Obviously, you mentioned your cultural pieces, but also these kind of things that have become quite important over the last couple of years, especially as we try to understand the society we're in, in terms of talking to people on the street, engaging with people, and sort of trying to find the stories out there. I find this fascinating. It's quite rare to hear journalists be kind of honest and self-effacing about the kind of thing that they do. But at the heart of what you're actually talking about as well is this kind of democracy of voices, and a sense that everybody's voice is valid. And I thought that was very interesting.
So there's two things to kind of unpack there. On the one hand, there's a problem in journalism that it is very white and very middle class, and in news journalism very focused, more male, and so that automatically blocks out a lot of voices, and kind of means that apart from people not getting their voices heard in that context, we also miss things as news organizations. Yeah. Like I think we were blindsided by things like Brexit. In the Republic a few years ago, we were blindsided by the water protests because people from those communities weren't working in news organizations for the most part. Won't generalize completely. And then in the context of that, as we're fixing that representation problem, it's important that we hear from people from different backgrounds. And I think it's really important that we don't just opinionize or talk to technocrats when we're discussing these things, but that we go and we see why people feel the way they feel, why they think the way they think. And I kind of, it's had a huge, being a reporter has had a huge effect on me, because I think when I thought about being a writer when I was younger, it was either fiction or kind of me waffling on with my opinion about things. And so reporting was a kind of something I fell into. And it's now the thing I think is the best for me as a person, apart from like I like doing it and I think I'm good at it. But I actually feel like it's really important. It's actually shut me up a bit more. You know, I've realized that opinions are 10 a penny and I have them. But it's really interesting when, like I was sent a number of times to the UK to try to drive around England and Wales mainly, talking to people about Brexit. And the most obvious thing I came away with is, whereas every now and again you got a complete stereotype of a Brexiteer or a Remain voter, for the most part people were complex and they had much more complicated ways of thinking about things than is sometimes represented in kind of on Twitter.
No, absolutely, yeah.
So I find that it's really useful. It means that your arguments for the things you believe in have to get a little bit more sophisticated, to be honest, because you realize you're not just arguing with a straw person. And then like the other thing is that essay also focuses with the fact that I, like as a journalist, we also have to be really responsible and balance the needs of your readers with the needs of the people you're interviewing, because it's very different. It would be very easy and awful, and some people do it, to go and take somebody vulnerable who's never spoken to the press before and make them look like a fool in the paper.
That's happened quite regularly.
And I think that the reality is that you have to kind of go into that realizing that you're in a position of power as a reporter, and whereas sometimes you're kicking up or you're interviewing somebody who should know well what they're getting into, like it's a well-established actor or a politician, you really do have to be, like, I hope that essay brings forward how I wrap myself in knots thinking sometimes about how to represent people on the page, because it's a big responsibility.
Well, I think it's very similar to, actually, it's quite similar to fiction writers and to playwrights and things like that, in the sense that the good playwrights and the good fiction writers actually care for the people that they're writing about, good or bad, whatever kind of characters it might be. They give them a respect and they give them a voice, and I think that's very true in your journalism. I mean, you know, and there's a number of different journalists around who you know, in the Guardian, for John Harris, you know, regularly going out and speaking to people, and quite often is very attacked for it, because you're talking to people who have quite difficult views and quite complex and nuanced views, but trying to find out why people think in a particular way is surely what democracies are about, because without those voices, surely it's going to get lost. I mean, on the converse of that, journalism and MSM, all that sort of, you know, kind of anti-mask. I mean, for example, the Journal in Dublin had a protest outside it the other day, and, you know, there is a sense that everything is lies and everything is made up, and you can't believe everything you read or is told to you. Is that something that you grapple with around, you know, what effect that's going to have on writing and honesty and all that kind of thing?
I think it's really important that we, like, there are some traditional journalistic standards we should really stick with. There's a lot that needs to change in journalism in terms of representation and in terms of, I mean, obviously the technology and how we're dealing with that, but some of the traditional values of, like, I think the really important thing is to act in good faith. And to be, like, so the example I always give is I really like The Economist and I like the Financial Times, even though their editorial line would be far to the right of me. But I believe they largely present their arguments in good faith. They're not operating on a principle of, I'm not going to present information that clashes with my ideas. You know, which is what happens in the internet battling. It's like sometimes people just lie, and other times people have a selective version of the truth. Whereas really good journalism, even, like, you can never eliminate bias, but you can balance it out by having a more representative group of people working in the field. And you can also undermine your own bias by forcing yourself to present facts that disagree with your beliefs, you know. So if there is a statistic that doesn't quite fit with my view on reality, I think it's important that I still present it in an article, you know. And I think that sort of good faith acting, I would like to think that if more people are conscious of that as it goes forward, that will outlast what's happening at the moment. My worry is that, like, there's startling information coming from the States about how few people are even getting their news from Fox. Like, so many people in America now are getting their news from the bubbles they exist in Facebook.
Directly from Facebook, from unnamed, unsourced kind of magazines that really exist. And I mean, and you can't interrogate where their sources are, and you can't work that out. It's like layers and layers of disinformation. Is the right way to put it, but like fog and smoke.
And I think that the thing about, like, whatever, journalism should be interrogated and it should be questioned, and biases should be questioned, and people should be presented with their biases, and people should be presented with mistakes they make, and all that's happening, and that's good on Twitter. But the thing with traditional news sources is the good ones adapt to that, and they respectfully go, okay, actually you're right, this was a mistake we made. And, you know, we should do that more, actually. We should kind of go, when we make a mistake, we should go, this was a mistake and we should have said this.
Don't bury the corrections on page 32. One of the best bits about that chapter is where you describe, and I read this last night, where you describe what it's like to interview an author or a celebrity or an actor or a cultural figure. And I felt very seen in that, Patrick. I've done a lot of these kind of interviews down the years and stuff like that, and that kind of, 25 minutes in, we've become mates. Feeling was I felt that.
There's a lot of interesting, like, that's an example of the type of essay where I go, okay, let me now interrogate what I feel and think about what I've been doing for the last 10 years. And I kind of tried to break things down and again, notice things about what I was doing that I wasn't conscious of doing, including that I've been saying for ages now, the 25-minute point is the point in an interview when the defenses generally are lowered, and people have moved off their talking points, and the journalist, like, two things are happening. Most people, I was going to say that aren't sociopaths, but I don't want to malign sociopaths. I don't know. Like, most people want to be liked, and they want the other person to be liked. So there's a kind of danger zone for both the journalist and the interviewer at the 25-minute point. But there was other things I noticed, like I have a little bit in that about how I dress when I go out on kind of general reporting jobs. And I realized that's what I was doing. I hadn't planned. I was dressing as neutrally as possible. My hair was shorter then, and my beard was more trimmed. And I was dressing in a way when I went out to, like, say, talk to randomers on the street in Lincolnshire about Brexit. I was dressing in a way that you could probably tell nothing about who I was, or
entirely nondescript.
Yeah, and I realized I was, like, not quite aware I was doing that, but that was kind of what I was doing. Like, I was kind of like, a lot of it was practical clothes, like anoraks and runners and backpacks, but some of it was just neutralization of the self.
Well, we're sort of coming towards the end of the time, but I wanted to just ask one last question about the whole of the book is shot through with a kind of thinking about art. It isn't the main theme of the book by any stretch of the imagination. You know, you're a cultural journalist, but you also, you know, we're in a band, and there's a lovely chapter about singing and the human voice. And I thought that was very affecting. Was that something that came on recently in the last sort of, 5 years, or is it something that's always been part of that use of your voice, of the kind of pleasure of singing?
That's a product of, so I sang for years in a band, but I probably didn't see myself as a singer.
Yeah.
And then it was a gradual thing. It started really when me and my wife Anna started a band called El Diablo, and it was a country band. So I was concentrating more on my voice sounding good. And then in about 9-10 years ago, we started going to these singing weekends run by a great North of England band called the Unthanks. And since then we've started. Now, we always did a bit of kind of singing in the house or going to friends' houses and singing, but in a much more structured way. In the last 5-6 years, we go to a friend's house, our friends come here, and we sing, and we sit around singing. And I find singing makes me feel very emotional, and it kind of hits. Singing in a group does something. I think I say in that essay that it could be used for malign purposes too. You start to feel really united. And if one person started slipping in a kind of dangerous agenda there, I'd be like, right, who do I stone? But there's something about it that I find really connecting. Yeah. And art and creativity in general, like I strongly feel like I've never really liked the distinction between high and low art. Stuff I've loved very complex kind of modernist novels, and I have loved really silly pop songs, or what other people would say are silly pop songs. And I just feel like making art, making music shouldn't just be for like a select bunch of people. And that was a creation of the last 100 years in mass production. And there is something incredibly liberating and useful. I read a great book by, I think it's John Carey, called What Good Are the Arts, a few years ago. And he talked about, now I have never checked out or sourced this, but he talked about how there's no evidence that, consuming music or art there's no tangible evidence that it makes you feel good, but actually there's loads of evidence that making it makes you feel good, or kind of affects you positively. And I just, it's something I beat the drum on. I think anyone who feels like they want to write something or sing something, it doesn't matter if you never become famous or successful at doing that thing. It's worth doing it because you will get something from it and you learn something about it. And again, you learn a lot from failing at it, my bands eventually became half okay, but only after some awful gigs, and the awful gigs were important.
Yeah, and it's the pleasure of doing it. It's the pleasure of that moment and the bonds that you create. And I suppose that, yeah, it's the emotional connections you make when you're making art as well is one of the best things. Well, Patrick, thank you very much for your time today. Just a reminder, everyone, that OK, Let's Do Your Stupid Idea is available in all good bookshops, but especially in No Alibis and Tertulia, which is in Westport, I believe. Maybe I'll go to visit. If it's a good bookshop, I'll go down to Westport and have a look. Yeah, enjoy the rest of your afternoon, Patrick, and thank you once again, and good luck with the rest of the book.
Thank you very much. It was good fun.
And come back to Belfast in real life soon.
Yeah, I hope to.
All right.